Thanks for making the time for us this morning. This is a controversial idea amongst many lawyers, amongst some politicians, although looking at opinion polls, it seems like the British public is broadly in support of the idea of offshore processing. How do we fix that situation? Why is there such a distinction there between those different sectors and their opinions?
Well, partly it's because of the lack of information, frankly, in the public domain. Partly, again, because of government ministers and indeed people like your last speaker. If people look at what happened with the Australian policy, they are likely to be much deterred from it. Australia has not offshored, as it's called, anyone since 2014. But it has held on to its offshore facilities because it's been unable to shut them down, even though it's been trying since 2017 to do so. And it's been paying huge amounts of money, unfortunately, to do incredible amounts of cruelty to the relatively few people that it's offshored, while people have continued to arrive in Australia, including by boat, since it introduced the policy all those years ago.
Because, of course, when that policy was introduced, the Liberal Party government, as it was then under Tony Abbott, put forward a lot of communications saying that not a single boat arrived in the next year after that policy was introduced. Are you saying that that was the case, but then it started to break down, the system started to break down sort of shortly after that situation?
Actually, there's no evidence that the system of offshoring itself had led at any time to a reduction in people arriving by boats. People continued after it was introduced. Australia went to even further lengths of not offshoring people, but physically intercepting boats and forcing them back dangerously to unsafe places. And yes, that did deter some boats. I mean, there were some scandalous reports of apparent connection between Australia and indeed the boats, the smugglers themselves operating them to do this. Now, it's a whole scandal that Australia has largely been condemned for internationally and domestically, and not just by lawyers, by doctors, by many members of the public and many politicians of all political persuasions. And it's something that Australia is trying to abandon because it's done so much harm. While it's true, certain Australian politicians who have long defended the policy make great hay about persuading foolish people here, frankly, amongst our government, to try and adopt it as some sort of cover to cover up for their shame.
Interestingly, though, depending on it's tricky to do in a conversation like this, but just in an intellectual space, if we leave the morality or otherwise of the policies to one side, of the two that we were talking about there, the pushing back the boats versus offshore detention and processing facilities, it's the former rather than the latter that actually worked to do anything in Australia, and we're thinking about adopting the latter. So potentially we wouldn't be able to replicate Australia's relative success in that area, morally or otherwise. I wonder, though, looking at why we've seen this big increase in boats crossing from France to the UK. I think I remember a conversation that we had on another show on this channel not so long ago, where you were saying that actually the number of lorries and trains that migrants were coming across on has fallen considerably. And it might be a similar number of people crossing the channel, but just doing it by other means. Is that still your assessment?
For most of the last 3 years, while there's been so much attention to boat crossings, there had been no increase, and at times there had been a fall in the number of people claiming asylum in this country. And we know the people crossing on these boats so visibly and so clearly are all seeking and do enter our asylum system. So clearly there was a huge displacement from one type of journey that was largely invisible to another type that's very visible and has got a lot of attention. Now, it is true that asylum numbers in the country here have started to go up from towards the end of last year. We'll have to see what impact that has. But they start from a relatively low base, and we still continue to be far behind other countries, including dramatically behind, for example, France, in the number of people who enter our asylum system or whom we provide asylum to.
Interesting that this particular situation of small boats coming across might not in and itself have represented in the last couple of years an increase in actual illegal migration. It might just be a different way in which people have come across. Really interesting there, and some big questions for policymakers. But for now, Steve Valdez-Simmons, thank you so much for joining us here and talking through that issue from the other side of the aisle.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.